He's been traveling to Vietnam, actually, but you can talk about that. Phil Keisling is the director of the Center of Public Service at Portland State University and has participated in Oregon civic spheres for over 3 decades. He started his foray into Oregon politics back in 1985 as a legislative assistant to then Speaker of the House, the late Vera Katz. Right? I didn't realize that until I read this. Good. So he's also served in the House of Representatives himself from 1989 to 1991, and then he became Oregon Secretary of State from 91 to 99. He's served on numerous not-for-profit boards, including the Oregon Business Association and Software Association of Oregon. Prior to his civic involvement in Oregon, he wrote for the Willamette Week in Portland and the Washington Monthly magazine in Washington, D.C., and he earned his bachelor's degree from Yale University. Yale is well represented today.
Overrepresented, if you ask me, Mr. Secretary.
Right.
But,
so why don't we, let's welcome Phil Keisling, okay? Thank you. Go ahead.
I thought I would just take a few minutes and share a couple thoughts and observations. And I, first of all, want to express my appreciation for Tim putting this on. It's been really impressive. Paul and Benjamin, loved your presentations. You've taught me many new things I wish I'd known back in the day. And appreciate all the interest here. I come from the Hatfield School of Government as well, and the importance of civil discourse, as you mentioned and your president mentioned, and data-driven decision-making and policy. Gee, what a radical concept to try to use information to have an informed conversation. We're going to have disagreements. This was a great conversation about communities of interest. You know, what are they? How do you define them? But I will first give a caveat. I am the one non-lawyer or non-PhD here. I've got my bachelor's degree in American Studies, and I got to play a lawyer at times. I felt back when I was Secretary of State back in the 90s. But let me take you back to those days of the 8-track tapes, the VHS versus Betamax debate, the fax machine, which seemed to be just the most amazing thing ever invented, the Princess phones that were still so much in vogue, and of course those yellow sticky notes that revolutionized how we did messaging between each other. And the technology of redistricting probably changed more profoundly in that period between 1981 and 1991 than it's even changed since. Yeah, we can do hundreds of simulations all at once. But literally in 1981, when Norma Paulus had to do redistricting, you would walk into a room, a secret room with all these things going on, and you'd see big sheets of paper printed at those massive printers that architects use, and you would see big sheets of Mylar, and you would have pens drawn, and you would have the census blocks with the numbers of people, and you would be drawing districts that way. And if you started down one course, and you just simply ran out of time. You had 45 days under the Oregon Constitution if it fell to you to do it. And once you start down a path, pretty much we're locked into it. By 1991, we had something called GIS. I can't remember the name of the program, ARC something. I had a young man named Chris Warner, who now works for the Portland Bureau of Transportation, who knew a little bit about computers. And I remember the conversation when it fell to me on July 1, 1991. I'm a 35-year-old Secretary of State. Who the hell was Phil Keisling getting this job in the first place? A whole different story. But it falls to me. We asked all 4 of the people to come in, the minority and majority parties in the House and Senate. They had 4 different plans. Everyone was telling me, well, I have to start with one of those plans because you only got 45 days. You know, pick the one that you're going to start with and then modify accordingly. And this young man, Chris Warner, who had staffed much of this, was, after all these presentations, I turned to Chris and I say, well, Chris, which plan do you think we ought to do? And he says, well, they're all kind of suck. Well, okay, then what, if you had your druthers, what would you do? Well, we start over. Okay, we're going to start over. What, really? Chris probably got 17 hours of sleep over 45 days doing this, but he had computers that in that embryonic stage let you do these things and look at continuity and compactness and the like. And I think, he did a remarkable job, and the thing did sue, and we had a couple things that definitely could have done better in retrospect. Very proud of what we came up with. But the revolution that began in 1991 that has now been just taken to even more heights along that same path of using the technology, not just when the legislature has 6 months, but when the Secretary of State under Oregon's Constitution still has 45 days. So that's very important to understand. I think it's also, though, if you're familiar with how modern campaigning now works, okay, election results are a very unsophisticated way to try to gauge your partisan results. They're a good proxy. They're certainly being used. But literally, the modern campaign today assigns each and every one of you 2 scores. You will have a score on your partisan leaning from 0 to 100, where 0 to 20 is the most partisan of Republican, 80 to 100 is the most reliable of Democrats, and everybody's in between. And you'll have a turnout score. So I'll look at Paul and say, Paul, I think you're a 55, but with an 87% chance of voting. Literally all 2.5 million voters, or almost all of them, are going to have each of these 2 scores. That's what's being used. You don't have to use party registration. It's a less predictor of how you'll actually vote. You'll use these algorithms. Now, at the end of the day, though, are we a dual world? Are we a Russia versus the United States Cold War era model? I think one of the best points that was made earlier today is that 35% of Oregon voters are non-affiliated, more than half 18 to 34-year-olds. And if we didn't have a forced closed primary, the current system we have, and there's many different ways to deal with that, I respect that. But because we have this closed primary, we'd probably have a lot more people joining minor parties, like the Independent Party of Oregon that Dan Meek founded, and we'd have a lot more people joining non-affiliated groups, but many join one of the parties because otherwise you put yourself into irrelevance into the primary election. So one of the fascinating things to me as I listen to the discussion about the partisanship going on is a lot of people are looking at it from a D versus R world as if there's no one else involved. So commendations to Secretary Richardson and the task force to recognize that you just don't have, well, we've got to have the equal number of Ds and Republicans, and then we're set, because now we're bipartisan. Okay, we are multi-partisan, and in many cases beyond partisanship in terms of how people are seeing themselves and affiliating. And yeah, there's some Republican-leaning independents or non-affiliated or minor in one election, but I think you're finding that they're changing their mind. A lot of those people voted for Trump, now they voted for Connor Lamb. And so this notion that there's a fixed universe of people's built-in partisanship is something that's a real challenge when we get into the issue of this. And Virginia's a great example. If you had surveyed 100 political professionals on either side of the aisle prior to the 2017 Virginia legislative races, I think probably 95, if not 100 of them would have said, well, not much is going to change. There's no chance of even coming close to flipping a 66 to 34 House of Representatives makeup. Because that Virginia legislature back in 2010, they just gerrymandered the hell out of the state. And, why should Democrats even try? Well, a lot of people on the ground either didn't know about that or they didn't care about it, and they knocked on a lot of doors and they contacted a lot of people, and even though the turnout wasn't that much higher, 12 incumbent Republicans got beat. 3 open seats got won by Democrats, and we know the story that it would have been a 50-50 split were it not for a tie vote and something coming out of a hat. So at the very moment that we're bringing to bear the most sophisticated data analytics to the conversation about party and party steering, we're seeing the underlying movement of American politics getting less and less certain in many ways around those traditional party labels. In the 1960s, when Baker versus Carr and Reynolds versus Sim and other decisions were made, there was maybe in Oregon 3 or 5%, none of the above. And today, as I noted, it's more than 10 times that. So I think that's important to kind of put into our analysis. Just a couple of other thoughts that I wanted to, observations I made from the very, very good presentations. Absolutely agree that community of interest is tough. I wrestle with it a lot. And we ended up with the criteria that Professor Wen talked about. That's a combination of here's the standards you should aim for, and here's the prohibitions, that the shall nots. Okay, and the statute's constructed in a very interesting way. So we borrowed a concept as we looked at this of both criteria that we just posited, even though they weren't in the statute, but we arguably should be, and a notion of a rebuttable presumption. Okay, the standard we actually did put out was a plus or minus 1%. That's much stricter than we probably could have gotten away with given the legal standards. But we just said when the Secretary puts out his plan, it's going to be plus or minus 1%. And that's our wiggle room to deal with those issues of boundaries and communities of interest and the like. But we also had a rebuttable presumption that if you don't have to split a county, you don't. And to get back to the city issue, if you don't have to split a city, you don't. Even though there are people in that city who won't be happy with it because, hey, I used to have 4 people I could call up, a Republican and a Democrat. I could work both sides of this. We said, no. If you can fit Medford into a single House district, it goes in a single House district. We also knew that those prohibitions about dilution of race and ethnicity caused some very, very interesting, and I don't know if does anyone remember the donut district? Okay, this was probably the most creative, innovative, and perhaps really strange thing we did. The Hispanic community, Latinx community in Cornelius area in Washington County, very concentrated in Cornelius, okay? And we felt that if we did certain things, we could be vulnerable to the dilution argument. So we created a Senate district that 2 districts, one completely surrounds the Latinx district. The donut, the hole in the donut was one, and then the rest of the donut made up the Senate district. People looked at that and go, have you lost your mind? And I think that was one of the things that got challenged as well. But it was an effort to address that prohibition, okay, because unlike the standard about politics, no district shall be drawn to benefit a party, okay, there's much more clarity, I'd argue, about no district shall be drawn to dilute a race, ethnicity of it, because that is very amenable to numerical quantification. So the final point I'll just make is that as one Supreme Court justice once observed about pornography, I'll know it when I see it. There's a little bit of that in gerrymandering, too. One person's gerrymander is going to be another person's community of interest, for example. I do think there's a lot to a book that has not been mentioned yet today, but it is worth mentioning, by Bill Bishop. It's called The Big Sort. I don't know how many of you are even familiar with it. But Bishop, about 20 years ago, made the observation that people are self-sorting in ways we've never seen before in American history. They are congregating in ways that are dividing them politically if you look at the standard Republican versus Democratic leaning model. Portland, 80-90% voting for Clinton. Certain parts of rural Oregon, probably not at 80 to 90%, but maybe 70%. So we are self-sorting. And if you put a standard of maximizing the number of competitive districts into the statute or into the computer model based on past election results, I think it'd be fascinating to see what that did in terms of damage to your compactness, your continuity, your boundaries in terms of cities and counties, et cetera. I think that is the fundamental tension that we arguably have in this discussion right now. And communities of interest is a proxy, or it's a close cousin of, partisan outcome. Okay. And to what extent would you literally be forced to gerrymander in terms of districts that look like salamanders, the original form of the term, Governor Jerry and the salamander put together? To what extent would you need to do gerrymandering in order to maximize the competitiveness of districts given how people are living and given those particular vote patterns? So it is science, but it is also a bit of art. It's an understanding of communities of interest. And I'll end with my favorite quote about the one that didn't meet the smell test. When I sat down that original day in July, because it was now in my lap, and I brought in one of the legislators who had been advocating for a particular plan. I asked this legislator, very interesting that you created a House district that took in the eastern half of Ashland, and by the time it wove its way across the Cascades, it took in half of Bend. Can you tell me what your community of interest concept was in drawing that particular proposed district? And he kind of paused, you kind of the deer in the headlights look, and he finally said, well, you know, Ashland, there's a lot of people that really like theater in Ashland, and a lot of people who like theater in Bend. Okay, I don't think so. Needless to say, that was not how we ended up drawing that district. So thank you for letting me make a couple of observations, and then I think we're ready to
Good.
your comments and
Can I
questions.
ask a
Yes.
question on that? Does the Secretary of State have, I mean, I should know this, but I don't. Does the Secretary of State have the ability by regulation to define communities of interest under the statute?
You mean by administrative rule?
Yes.
It's a good question whether we have the authority to do rulemaking for that particular statute. It's a good question. We did not do it by rulemaking. We didn't have time. But what we did is we put out there a set of criteria that we were going to follow. So I think, for example, on cities that could have been put in one district, we succeeded in all but 3 or 4 cases of it. And we just simply told people, here's how we scored against our own criteria. Portland, for example, Portland has a part of its city limits which are in Clackamas County, so we faced the question, do you divide on the county line or divide on the city line? But it's a good question, Thane. I don't think we went through the rulemaking process, but the question you asked is if the legislature fails to add more criteria, that could the Secretary of State, for example, impose a plus or minus X% of population
Simply
standard?
define communities of interest.
That would be a lot tougher.
Actually, it doesn't have to be put into an administrative rule. If the legislature and the governor can't agree by July 1st, then it goes to the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of State then will determine his or her own criteria as far as the definition is concerned. I mean, you got the statute, and then it gets turned over to the Supreme Court 45 days later.
But the court could overrule you.
The court
basically
could say, no, wait a second, that's not appropriate.
that's a violation, because clearly Ashland and Bend are not so much in common, right?
Of course, we had a challenge with that in 2001, when you had Secretary Bill Bradbury. The House and the Senate passed a plan, and Governor Kitzhaber, he vetoed it. Yeah, I was thinking Kitzhaber, Kulingowski. Kitzhaber vetoed it, and so it went to Bill Bradbury, and then who made some major changes. And the Republican Party actually sued because they thought it was so unfair. And I remember at that time being asked about it, and I said, okay, you want the judiciary to override the constitutional provision on how this is going to be done because you think it's gerrymandering? Unlikely. And of course, it wasn't so egregious that they made any kind of a ruling, and it stood. So, but I want you to know, I want to not be in a position, I want to be a Secretary of State, but I would like not to have the decision-making decision on how to do this. I don't want to be doing the redistricting. That's why we have been proposing the idea of a constitutional amendment to change the way that Oregon does it so that we can implement a citizen-based, nonpartisan, neutral way of doing it that can set an example for the entire country. I mean, that is what the goal was with our multi-partisan task force that we had. And if it's going to happen, it probably would be by an initiative. I mean, I doubt if there's going to be a referral from, regardless of which party's in charge, it's unlikely that they're going to want to make that kind of a change. But we have the opportunity to do it, and I hope that I don't have the responsibility to do redistricting, because that would mean that we failed in taking advantage of this opportunity to change things in a constitutional way that will affect us for generations to come. So, questions, yes?
With the motor voter law, there's a lot more people that have signed up to vote because it's it's automatic. And those people are a lot of the unaffiliateds. Do you feel that they should be given as much weight as people who have already chosen? They know their party, they know what they want, they're not unaffiliated? That the unaffiliateds now with motor voter, where they were forced to sign up anyway, they might not have the same interest. Do you feel they should have the same weight?
Kind of like 3/5? That was a lot of numbers, sorry.
Well, not only do I think they should, they have to. There should be no question under our Constitution that it doesn't matter whether a voter chooses to affiliate with a private organization or not, known as a political party, whether they have any less rights or any less weight in the process. And I want to also, and this is a good question because it underscores a very important point about the discussion about partisanship. There is political parties. What are they exactly? They are private organizations. Okay? There is nothing in any constitution that speaks to the existence of a political party. Not the U.S. Constitution, not the Oregon Constitution. Maybe some of the other constitutions do. So there's nothing that even requires any office to be elected on a partisan basis or any voter to be allowed to register on a partisan basis. There is nothing that governs that except for the choices that are made in statutory law. Statutes that can be amended by elected representatives deciding to, as 22 states have decided to not have party registration for voters. And as 2 states have decided, Washington and California, to not elect and nominate people on a party registration basis. And people can change that through the initiative process. So there's nothing sacrosanct about parties per se. And I'll go back to one of the original points, is that much of our conversations about redistricting that started in the 60s assumed a world that in some ways is as foreign today as the world of Dr. Strangelove and the Russians in the United States, and the rest of the world kind of wasn't aligned. They were all just fighting to be which camp are we going to be in. We are much more a multipolar world right now. And I'm not sure what all the implications are for that in terms of this conversation. But you know, when 52% of 18 to 34-year-olds now are not affiliated, and it was still a plurality even before automatic voter registration, it boosted our numbers, I think, by 200,000 went from 2.3 million to 2.5 million total voters, and most of them are non-affiliated. But most young people have made a very clear statement to the 2 political parties. With all due respect, I'm a member of one of them, you're a member of the other one, Democrat. But they've basically said, we don't particularly care for what we see and perceive of either one of you standing for and talking about. Yeah.
It's absolutely the truth. There's a transition that's taking place in the population, and we're behind the scene. We always will be. I mean, we are a 2-party system based on history, but I had somebody come up to me after the last election saying, you know, you've got to really look into this because there's fraud and corruption in the election process. And he happened to be Republican, and I said, if there was, I wouldn't have been elected. You know? And he's going, oh, okay, and he walked away. But the mere fact that I was able to be elected, I believe, shows that the idea is not a, you know, is there a D or an R? You know, that there were enough voters who decided that maybe I could do a good job as Secretary of State, and they gave me a chance, and I'm hoping that I am doing a good job, and I hope that I will. My wife says if I don't get reelected, it's okay. But I mean, we got grandkids and stuff. But I said, but if I do plan on trying to be here as long as I can to bring about change, to bring about a renewal of thought, and not just a continuation of traditional processes that are based on the world is different now. And so it's an exciting time to be here.
And historically, the unaffiliated do not participate in the process as much as those who commit to a party. That's historical data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So you're assuming they're going to now participate equally with the Democrat or Republican.
Oh,
That's
no,
what
no,
you're saying.
I don't think we're assuming that at all.
Well,
I mean,
you're saying
not-
equal weight.
No. In terms of redistricting law, every everyone is equal. In fact, redistricting is not based even on a registered voter, not even based on a citizen. It is based on residents. That's been settled by the Supreme Court pretty definitively. You count everybody in a district, and that's how you do your population. Non-affiliated voters do not vote in party primaries at all. They can vote for the judges and the nonpartisan offices, and they vote at a much lower rate.
Yeah.
Presidential rates, elections, they're now getting pretty close to Democrats and Republicans in presidential races. They are. But I want to make one other point that's raised by the non-affiliated issue, and you raised it with the local preemption argument. Oregon has had, I think now, 10 counties in the last 20 years that used to elect their county commissioners on a partisan basis. Democratic nominee, Republican nominee running the general election, where the voters in that county have decided, no, we don't want to do that anymore. We want to do it on a nonpartisan basis because we don't think there's a Republican or Democratic way to fix a pothole, for example. You have a lot of state legislatures that do not allow counties to make that kind of decision on their own. The legislature forces them to elect their local officials on a partisan basis. Now, the parties love that. Okay, it's a way for them to continue and have their power. But I would argue, particularly when you see 70 to 30% vote margins in these counties where the question has come up, Union County, Wallowa County, these are not exactly blue counties, that people across the political spectrum are looking at things in a more, I would just say, ecumenical way, while at the same time our politics have gotten more polarized. And there's a paradox there that is probably longer to talk about than we have time.
It's really a challenge. I think it has a lot to do with the technology that we have and where people go for their news.
Yep.
There was a big issue about 6 months ago, and I was watching the reporting on certain stations and then going back and forth, and it was like, are they talking about the same issue? Because,
Fox, NBC.
It was really fascinating
Yeah.
because of the approach that was taken. And so if you're only getting your news from one place, then you're actually receiving propaganda from either side instead of, this is the rest of the story or
Yeah,
something.
yeah, I think that's right. Yeah,
Other questions? Yes. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, who's to appoint these folks on the commission? 'Cause I'm from Washington State originally, and they also switched to a commission system that's supposed to be bipartisan. And all it meant was that the parties appointed their political choices, and you just removed the process away from the people. So instead of going to their representatives they voted for and saying, I don't like how you're doing this, it was done by political appointees on a commission in a back room that you had to go to a website to find where they were meeting, and maybe you can make it, or maybe you couldn't. It wasn't good.
So it's not about looking good, it's about actually doing good, right? And so how do you avoid gaming the system? And so the plan that, we didn't have a firm plan. What we had is a large group of people. We had certain things that we agreed to, but one of the ideas was that you would have a selection made by a group of actuaries that would be selected, that there would be a pool that would be of people that qualified, which means they can't be candidates, they can't be involved in the system. The idea is to stay away from those that would have a stake in the outcome, that would be more interested in party or power than in what's best and neutral for the people. And so then ultimately there would be a boiling down of a pool of 20 of the party that has the most registered voters, 20 of the party that has the second most registered voters, and then 20 of the other pool. And then there would be a random selection among those individuals. And so we had a lot of discussion on that, and there would be details that would need to be worked out, but it would be neutral individuals choosing from a pool of neutral individuals so that you have a citizen committee, not experts, not those picked by parties. Like some recommendations are that you have the House and the Senate, the majority and the minority leaders each pick a person, and then there will be some way to pick a fifth person. Well, if that were to happen, that fifth person becomes the most popular person in the world, right? Because it would all be about how do you get that extra vote to tip the scale one way or the other. And so we're trying to focus not just on fairness, but transparency and a nonpartisan, non-political selection of the group.
And why have party representatives? I mean, how is this nonpartisan, neutral person going to be representing the party that is supposed to be representing?
Well,
I don't quite.
I think the idea was they wouldn't come to the table as representing a party.
they'd be selected from a pool.
Might have a personal affiliation with the party. I mean, I think your question is a really good one, because I think at the end of the day, any less bad system than what we arguably have is never going to be able to address every potential criticism about the selection. I mean, the devil is in the details, and this is the key detail. And why I don't like this kind of let the powerful pick their representatives in a 50-50 way and ignore the 35% that don't have an affiliation with the party, this was, I think, a real sincere effort to try to break out of that conundrum. Now, whether it proves to be perfect or not, if we ever get to the point of implementing it, and I'm not even sure it's the single best way to do it. But I'd like to have personally, I'd like to see the conversation about how best to do it and how to learn the lessons from Washington where it wasn't done so well, and what's the best that's being done in California or Iowa, and then say, could Oregon do it even better? And to give it a try. I temper my enthusiasm for a change by just being a realist. Don't expect the world changes suddenly because you now have an independent commission, but with the sense that I think it's time to give it a try. And the main reason is not that I don't think legislatures are functionally incapable of ever doing it right, or that secretaries of state can't do it right. I think it's just because of the nature of the lack of credibility and trust in our major institutions right now. And if we have the opportunity to try to help restore it and the sense of legitimacy in these institutions, we probably ought to take it at this time in our history. And I think this would help us. And it may prove something we need to revisit, 10, 20 years down the line. But I think we should try to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
The proposal in terms of ecumenical commission, if you will, reminds me somewhat of the Citizens Initiative Review Commission, okay, which was designed with a very similar purpose in mind: provide honest citizen representation with respect to certain process kinds of policy considerations. If I'm correct, they are somewhat alike. How has that process worked? And has it been relatively free of capture?
The challenge is always in who selects and what the process is to select the committee members. If it's mostly urban because you've got more people in the urban area than in a rural area, that can influence the outcome. As far as how it's worked, it hasn't had much significance. We're talking about a commission that would kind of evaluate things and then give their
Ballot measures, right.
Their
Chosen
ballot
at
measures.
random.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, I haven't heard much about them. I don't know if very many people read their reports, but I haven't heard anything actually either way. You'd be closer to that. What do you think?
Look, I was a big supporter of it. I like the idea. Again, I think it's better than not having it. I had a ballot measure myself that I promoted the open primary. Big supporter of it. Citizen Commission was duly chosen. The Citizen Commission convened for 2 days. They just decided it was a terrible idea. I think it was like 2-1 against it. Was I disappointed? Yeah. Did I feel some of the arguments that were made were dishonest? Yeah. They probably felt some about my arguments. I don't think many people knew what the Citizens Initiative Commission had done on that particular ballot measure, but when the votes came in, we lost 2-1. So,
could be an indication.
Pretty representative of it. Again, I think we're at a time in the Republic's history where we should be willing to take some risks, to do some innovation, that pull more people into the process, that and know that it's not going to be perfect. But the alternative is you continue to do business as usual about some of these things. So Let me one other thought. I thought, as I sat here and was thinking about the combination of the science and the art, if you have the Citizens Commission, but you have a very transparent process that looks at those, I'll call them the hard science components, the continuity, the county boundaries, the city boundaries, the things that are very mathematical, 0 or 1, you know, how many counties did you split, how many cities did you split? And you have that in full public view. So that when the commission that gets appointed redistricting then has to go through and weigh the community of interest arguments and the not diluting and the plus or minus and the like, you'll have a public process there, and you'll be able to kind of compare what they come up with you know, what some of the science would suggest. And I don't think the science should run at the notion that that you can find the best plan simply out of computer algorithms. Don't buy it. Okay, but can it build and set some boundaries so that you're at least within this range and not way out over here? Okay, and maybe that's a way to ameliorate the concerns that it becomes captive. But yeah, there's always going to be a risk that anything becomes captive. Yeah.
Okay. Question I'd like to ask those that haven't asked questions first.
So with the big sort that you were talking about and all these other factors that kind of are coming into just it being harder and harder to draw districts that feel like they represent especially like minority political opinions in areas, how is there some point where having either conservative people in urban areas or liberal people in rural areas becomes communities of interest, or is there a different system that we can use in order to try to solve some of those issues? Because it seems to me like one of the problems that we have is that it feels more like a culture clash when all representatives coming from specific regions are representing, you know, a certain party or a certain viewpoint, even if you took parties out of it. So I'm just wondering, how can we use redistricting in a way to try to like solve that, or is that a completely inappropriate use of districting? And just like as 2 examples, right? Like one would be something like Vermont. I think they have their district size per person represented is something like 10 to 15 times smaller than ours. So you are able to have like more nuance in that. Maybe that's impractical because that would mean we'd have a ridiculous amount of representatives. Proportional representation is another one. But there's like a lot of things like that out there that I think are things that count.
Just briefly, I'll say whoever controls the definitions of community of interest can determine the outcome. And so that is the challenge. The statute tries to give certain guidelines as far as, you know, your boundaries and so forth, but then when it has community of interest, that definition can be so broadly defined, but it needs to be transparent and it needs to be open. I think there should be public meetings where the discussions are taking place, and possibly have a website long before the decision is made, like so that as soon as the census comes out, that people that are interested could go to it, have the tool, the programming, that they can come up with their ideas and make different suggestions and have it be a more public, open, transparent process that ultimately a decision has to be made, and then whoever makes it has to live with the consequences of that decision.
Yeah, when we had to look at the northwest corner of Oregon in Clatsop County, and Thane alluded to it before, we originally had proposed a Senate district that I think went from Astoria and just took the counties as they were stacked, and it went all the way down, I think, to Yahats or below. Someone pointed out that on a summer day it'd take you 8 hours to drive from Astoria, particularly with the RVs and all that on 101. And people say that doesn't feel right to us. And we ended up wrapping it around the corner of Oregon and then splitting Clatsop County and having a district on the river. It was one of the few cases that we did it. But we said explicitly, here's why we violated our own criteria. Our rebuttable presumption is you don't do it if you can help it. But here's why we did. Now, that may or may not have stood up in court or made a difference in court, but at least when we're communicating back to the people of Clatsop and Columbia counties in this case, we could explain why we did it that way. And some liked it, some hated it, but it was allowed to stand.
Okay, final question?
I was wondering what research you're using to base your opinions on, because my information came from the Pew Research Center from a couple of years ago, and they looked in depth at voters, and unaffiliateds do not vote that much. That's their research. It's based on research plus books.
Well, we agree they do not vote, they do not have as high a turnout as Democrats and Republicans, you're absolutely right, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that they're younger.
And the question is,
That's
though,
right.
everybody
That's
gets a
right.
chance to vote. You know, we're trying to
I
encourage,
could
you know,
show
to
you
do that,
statistics as of a few months ago. Over
stand by.
50 years here in Oregon, she wants to right here.
Okay, well, afterward, there could be a
Yeah,
conversation.
but no, you're right about they're not voting as frequently. I think your question was that because they don't vote as frequently, they should have less weight in our decisions about redistricting? Right, and that's where we disagree, I think. Yeah, yeah. Because again, it is one person, one vote. It's not one citizen, one vote. It's not one voter or frequent voter, one vote. It's one person, one vote. That's the constitutional principle. And the Supreme Court gets the final call on that.
All right, everyone, it's been a very interesting time. Thank you. And
Thank you.
Thank you, Phil.
Appreciate it.
And we want to especially call out Tim Johnson, the director of the
putting this
Center for
together.
Governance and Public Policy Research. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it. Bringing this to our campus was fantastic.